The knock on the door was sharp and impatient, cutting through the quiet of Gideon's small cottage. He set down the wooden pestle he'd been using to grind herbs and sighed. No one ever came to visit this far out of town unless it was trouble or the magistrate. Wiping his hands on his apron, he crossed the room and pulled open the heavy oak door. The magistrate was, as expected, standing on the doorstep, but it wasn't his presence that caused Gideon's brow to furrow. Behind him stood two young women, or at least they looked mostly like women. The one on the left had amber eyes that glowed faintly in the dusk, framed by a cascade of wild, silver-gray hair that matched the large wolf ears perched atop her head. Her posture was tense, shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight. Beside her, the shorter one had vibrant orange-red hair pulled into a loose braid, her playful smile showing sharp teeth that matched the fox-like tail swaying lazily behind her. "Gideon," the magistrate said, clearly eager to get this over with. "These are Lyra and Kale, exiles from the beast-folk realm. They've been sent here as punishment, and by decree, they are now under your charge." Gideon blinked, stunned. "You can't be serious. What am I supposed to do with them?" "You're to keep them out of trouble. Teach them human ways, make them productive. Or at least, keep them from tearing up the countryside." The magistrate handed Gideon a scroll bearing the royal seal. "Orders from the capital. You're the only one far enough from the village to keep this quiet." Gideon's gaze shifted to the two girls, who were now sizing him up just as intently. Lyra's lip curled slightly, as if unimpressed, while Kale's amber eyes gleamed with mischief. "This is ridiculous," Gideon muttered, but he knew better than to argue with the magistrate. He reluctantly stepped aside, gesturing for the girls to come in. Lyra entered first, her movements deliberate, predatory, her eyes sweeping the room like she was hunting for hidden dangers. Kale sauntered in after her, her tail flicking playfully as she peered around with open curiosity. Once the door closed, the tension in the room became almost palpable. "This is quaint," Kale said, running her fingers along the edge of a dusty bookshelf. Her voice was lilting, almost teasing. "So, you're the human who's supposed to keep us in line?" "I'm not supposed to do anything," Gideon replied, his voice firm. "If you're staying here, you follow my rules." Lyra crossed her arms, her ears twitching. "We didn't ask to be dumped here, and we don't need some human babysitter." Gideon met her glare evenly. "Good. Then you won't have any trouble pulling your weight around here." Kale stifled a laugh, earning a sharp look from Lyra. Gideon turned away, already regretting this arrangement. "Follow me," he said gruffly, leading them to the small spare room that would now be theirs. "It's not much, but it'll do." The room was plain. Two simple cots, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the woods. Lyra eyed the setup with disdain but said nothing. Kale, however, immediately flopped onto one of the cots, stretching languidly. "Better than a jail cell," she remarked, grinning up at the ceiling. "Barely," Lyra muttered, sitting stiffly on the edge of the other cot. Gideon folded his arms. "Dinner's in an hour. Until then, stay out of trouble." With that, he left them, retreating to his workroom to process what had just happened. He wasn't used to company, let alone two volatile beastfolk who clearly wanted nothing to do with him or each other. Still, he'd been given an order and he would see it through. But even as he ground herbs into fine powders, their presence lingered in his mind. The sharp defiance in Lyra's eyes, the playful challenge in Kale's smile. It was unsettling, but there was also something intriguing about them. When dinner came, the atmosphere was tense. Lyra ate in silence, her movements precise and restrained, while Kale chatted aimlessly, trying to draw reactions from both of them. "So, Gideon," Kale said, leaning forward, "what's a man like you doing all the way out here alone? Don't humans usually crave company?" "I prefer the quiet," he replied curtly. Kale's gaze lingered on him, her head tilting slightly. "I guess we'll see how long that lasts." Lyra shot her a warning look, and Kale simply smirked, returning to her food. That night, Gideon lay awake, the faint sounds of their voices carrying through the walls. He tried not to think about what the coming days would bring, but the unease in his chest refused to fade. As the wind howled outside, he wondered, not for the first time, what he had gotten himself into. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light onto Gideon's small garden. He stood at the edge of the plot, hoe in hand, watching as Lyra and Kale emerged from the cottage. Lyra looked irritated, her silver-gray hair messy from sleep, while Kale yawned dramatically, her tail swishing lazily behind her. "You're up late," Gideon said, his tone neutral. "I've already been working for hours." Kale stretched, arching her back like a feline. "We're not used to human schedules. Beast folk don't exactly rise with the roosters." "Well, you'll need to learn," Gideon replied, tossing the hoe to Lyra. She caught it easily, her sharp amber eyes narrowing at the implication. "What's this for?" she asked, holding it like a weapon. "You're going to till the soil," Gideon explained, his patience thin. "The sooner you both start contributing, the sooner you'll find your place here." Lyra snorted but stepped forward, gripping the hoe with a bit too much force. She drove it into the ground, her movements rough and imprecise. Dirt flew in every direction, and within moments, she had broken the handle clean in half. Gideon pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's not a weapon. You need to use finesse." "Maybe you should have given me something sturdier," Lyra retorted, tossing the broken tool aside. Kale, who had been leaning against the fence, burst into laughter. "Finesse? With her? You might as well ask a bear to sew a quilt." Lyra rounded on her, her ears flattening against her head. "Why don't you do something useful instead of running your mouth?" "Gladly," Kale said, a sly grin spreading across her face. "But I'm better at, let's say, delicate tasks." "Then go weed the garden," Gideon interjected, gesturing to a patch overrun with greenery. Kale wrinkled her nose but obeyed, crouching gracefully to pull at the weeds. She worked slowly, deliberately, her sharp nails cutting through the roots with ease. After a few minutes, she glanced up at Gideon, her golden eyes glinting with amusement. "See? Delicate," she said, holding up a perfectly uprooted weed. Gideon shook his head, muttering under his breath. Lyra, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to fetch another hoe from the tool shed, grumbling the entire time. The morning passed in fits and starts, with Lyra alternating between frustrated growls and determined silence as she tried to master the unfamiliar task. Kale continued to find ways to make her work seem effortless, occasionally tossing out snide comments that only fueled Lyra's irritation. By midday, Gideon called for a break. He set out bread, cheese, and a jug of water on a makeshift table in the shade of the trees. The three of them ate in relative silence, save for the occasional crunch of bread or the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You're not half bad at this, you know," Kale said suddenly, directing her comment toward Gideon. "At what?" he asked, not looking up. "Keeping us in line," she replied, her tone light but edged with something more serious. "Most humans would have run for the hills by now." "Most humans aren't me," Gideon said simply. Kale's lips curved into a small smile, but she didn't press further. As they finished eating, Gideon decided to address the growing tension between the two girls. "Look," he said, his voice firm, "you're both here because you've been given a second chance. I don't care what happened before, but if you want to make this work, you need to figure out how to get along." Lyra's ears twitched, but she didn't respond. Kale, on the other hand, leaned back against the tree trunk, her expression thoughtful. "Fine," Kale said after a moment, but only because he asked nicely. Lyra shot her a glare but reluctantly nodded. "I'll try. No promises." It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gideon found himself in his workroom, sorting through a bundle of herbs. The rhythmic sound of grinding and the faint scent of mint and lavender filled the air, helping to soothe the lingering tension from the day. A soft knock on the doorframe drew his attention. He looked up to see Kale standing there, her arms crossed and her tail flicking behind her. "Need something?" he asked. Kale stepped inside, her movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Just curious," she said, glancing at the array of herbs on the table. What are you making? Medicine, Gideon replied, returning to his work. For cuts, burns, that sort of thing. Kale moved closer, her gaze fixed on his hands as he ground the herbs into a fine powder. You're good at this, she said softly. It's just practice, he said, though her tone caught him off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Kale reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was light, almost tentative, but it sent a ripple of awareness through him. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For what? For putting up with us, she said, her usual teasing edge absent. Gideon glanced at her, surprised by the sincerity in her eyes. Before he could respond, she pulled her hand away and smiled, her usual playful demeanor returning. Don't let it go to your head, she said, turning toward the door. Good night, Gideon. As she disappeared down the hall, Gideon leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. For all their differences, there was something about these girls. Something that made him wonder if their arrival was as much a punishment for him as it was for them. The next morning began quietly, with the usual hum of the countryside waking around them. Gideon was up before sunrise, as always, tending to his usual chores. He hadn't expected Lyra and Kale to rise early after their slow start the day before, but to his surprise, he found Lyra already outside, pacing the edge of the garden. Her movements were sharp and restless, her tail flicking in irritation as her wolf ears twitched at every sound. She paused when she noticed him approaching, her eyes narrowing slightly. Couldn't sleep? Gideon asked, keeping his tone neutral. Something like that, Lyra muttered. She folded her arms and looked out toward the woods. It's too quiet here. It's unnatural. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Quiet is unnatural? For someone like me, yes, Lyra said, her voice low. Back home, there was always noise. Packmates, the wind in the mountains, the sound of the hunt. It feels like being caged. Gideon studied her for a moment. The defensiveness in her posture was familiar, an instinctive reaction to vulnerability. He'd seen it before in soldiers, back when he'd been one himself. You'll get used to it, he said simply, turning toward the shed to grab some tools. Lyra scoffed. Doubt it. As Gideon prepared for the day's work, Kale finally appeared, her steps unhurried as she stretched her arms above her head. Morning, she said, her voice warm and teasing as usual. What's on today's agenda, boss? You're helping Lyra with the garden, Gideon replied, handing her a small spade. Try not to distract her too much. Kale laughed, twirling the spade like a toy. No promises. Lyra shot Gideon a withering look, but she didn't argue. The two girls set to work, though it was clear from the outset that their personalities were as incompatible as ever. Kale's light-hearted remarks clashed with Lyra's no-nonsense focus, and it wasn't long before their bickering reached a fever pitch. Stop pulling the roots like that, Lyra snapped. You're making a mess. Relax, Kale said with an exaggerated sigh. It's not like these weeds are going to file a complaint. Gideon intervened before the argument could escalate further. Enough, he said, his tone firm. You're not children. Figure out how to work together, or neither of you eats tonight. The ultimatum silenced them, though the tension lingered. Still, they managed to get through the morning without any major incidents, and by midday, they'd made significant progress in the garden. During their lunch break, Gideon noticed something unusual. Despite their constant bickering, Lyra and Kale were starting to settle into a rhythm. Their movements were more coordinated, their arguments less venomous. It wasn't peace by any means, but it was a start. That evening, after the day's work was done, Gideon found himself alone on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of the forest. He was nursing a cup of tea when Lyra appeared, her steps quiet but deliberate. Mind if I sit? She asked, her tone softer than usual. Gideon gestured to the empty chair beside him. For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of the night filling the space between them. Then, Lyra spoke, her voice low and hesitant. I'm not good at this, she admitted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. At what? Fitting in, taking orders, playing nice. Gideon set his cup down, considering his response. No one's asking you to change who you are, he said finally. But you're not in the mountains anymore. If you want to survive here, you'll have to adapt. Lyra's ears flattened slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. You don't know what it's like, she said after a moment. Being cast out, losing everything that made you. You. I know more than you think, Gideon replied, his voice quiet. Lyra glanced at him, her sharp eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slightly and said no more. Later that night, as Gideon prepared for bed, he heard a faint knock at his door. Opening it, he found Kale standing there, her expression unusually serious. What is it? He asked. Kale hesitated, her golden eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. Then, without warning, she stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. You're different, she said softly. Gideon frowned. Different how? From other humans, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not afraid of us. You don't treat us like monsters. You're not monsters, Gideon said firmly. Kale's lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, she lingered there, her presence warm and disarming. Then, just as quickly, she stepped back. Good night, Gideon, she said, her usual playful tone returning. As she disappeared down the hall, Gideon stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling. Something was shifting between them, something he couldn't quite name, and for the first time, he wondered if this arrangement would end up changing him as much as it was changing them. The days blurred into one another, the rhythm of work settling into something almost comfortable. Lyra and Kale, despite their constant friction, had learned to cooperate in the garden. They even began to share the occasional quiet moment, though Gideon knew better than to assume peace had truly settled between them. It was a fragile truce, held together by necessity rather than friendship. Still, Gideon noticed a change in their dynamic. Lyra, while still prone to irritation, had started to let her guard down just a little. Kale, ever the instigator, had begun to respond with less teasing and more genuine care. There was a softness in the way she looked at Lyra when she thought no one was watching. And Lyra, for all her pride, had started to show small, fleeting moments of gratitude when Kale helped her with something she struggled with. One afternoon, while Kale and Lyra worked near the garden's edge, Gideon was putting away some tools in the shed when he heard voices raised in laughter. He stepped outside, curious, and found Kale crouched on the ground with a handful of wildflowers, tossing them at Lyra. You look ridiculous, Lyra grumbled, swiping the flowers from her face and shaking them free from her hair. You should smile more, you know, Kale teased, her tone light. I bet you're even pretty when you smile. Lyra growled but didn't swipe at her this time. Instead, she picked up a flower and, with a half-rolled eye, tucked it into Kale's hair. There. Now you're pretty. Kale blinked, surprised, before a slow grin spread across her face. Well, thank you. I didn't know you cared. Gideon watched them in silence, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It was odd seeing them like this, so human, so normal. It reminded him, not for the first time, of just how far removed their worlds had been. After a moment, Kale stood, brushing the dirt off her knees. We're done for today, right? Gideon nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. For now, you're both doing better than I expected. Lyra snorted, clearly not accustomed to giving praise. Don't get used to it. That's the spirit, Kale said, her smile wide and teasing as ever. Now, how about a break? Something cold to drink. Gideon raised an eyebrow. I don't keep cold drinks around. Sure you do, Kale said with a mischievous glint in her eyes. You're just holding out on us. I don't think you'd like my idea of a refreshing drink, Gideon replied, crossing his arms. Oh, what, like muddy water? Coeltea said. No, he said, smirking. A bitter herbal tea. It's the kind of drink that'll put hair on your chest. Kale laughed. I'll pass, but I bet Lyra would be game for it. Lyra shot her a glare but didn't respond. Instead, she moved toward the house, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation. Gideon watched her go, the air between him and Kale thickening just slightly. There was something different about the way she stood now, a certain vulnerability he hadn't seen before. You sure you're not going to try that tea? He asked, his voice softer. Kale didn't immediately answer. Instead, she glanced at the space where Lyra had been moments before. You know, she's not so bad, Kale said, her voice less flippant than usual. Gideon blinked, unsure of what to say. I thought you two were barely tolerating each other. Kale shrugged, a little self-conscious. Well, we are. But I think she's starting to come around. Just takes time. I wouldn't hold my breath, Gideon said, his tone light but knowing. Lyra's a hard one to crack. I've cracked harder nuts, Kale replied with a wink. But there was a warmth in her smile that belied the usual teasing edge. The evening came quickly, and with it, a chill in the air that signaled the approaching winter. As they sat down for a modest dinner in the small dining room, the conversation turned to more practical matters. Where to store the harvested crops, how to repair the roof before the snow came, and whether they would be able to keep the firewood dry. Gideon took a bite of bread, his thoughts wandering. He hadn't expected life to settle into something resembling routine, but here it was, nonetheless. The steady rhythm of labor, the shared silences, the occasional banter. It was something he'd never imagined, not in 1,000 years. Yet, as much as the work brought them together, there was a growing tension he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the simmering friction between Kale and Lyra that still lingered, though that was part of it. No, it was something deeper, something unsaid. After the meal, Kale stood, stretching languidly. I'll clean up, she said, her voice pleasant but with a hint of finality. You two go relax. Gideon raised an eyebrow. You don't have to. I want to, Kale interrupted, her eyes flashing with a hint of mischief. You've earned it. He nodded, feeling a slight unease. Thank you, then. As he left the kitchen, he found Lyra sitting by the fire, her eyes flickering in the dim light. She didn't acknowledge him at first, instead staring into the flames. He hesitated before speaking. You're quiet tonight. Lyra didn't look at him, but her voice was soft. Just thinking. About. Lyra shrugged, her eyes still fixed on the fire. Everything. This place. You. All of it. Gideon didn't know what to say. The last few days had felt like a strange dream. Every conversation, every moment between them, felt like it was leading somewhere. Somewhere neither of them had anticipated. I don't know why I'm here, Lyra said quietly. I don't know why you're putting up with me. Gideon took a step forward, his voice low. I don't know either, but I'm not the type to abandon people. There was a long silence before Lyra finally turned her head to meet his gaze. For a moment, their eyes locked, the weight of their shared isolation hanging between them. It was then that Kale entered, breaking the tension like a lightning strike. Well, look at you two, she said with a teasing smile. Getting cozy by the fire? Lyra rolled her eyes, but there was a faint flush in her cheeks. Not yet, she muttered. Kale laughed, her voice full of mischief. Oh, I'm sure you'll get there soon enough. Gideon couldn't tell if Kale was joking or not, but the words lingered in the air long after she left them alone once again. The tension hadn't broken, it had only thickened. Something was changing, something neither of them could ignore much longer. The next few days felt heavier than usual, each morning stretching into the next with an unspoken tension hanging in the air. As the weather turned colder, the warmth of the fire became a welcome refuge, though the heat it provided didn't seem to reach the spaces between Gideon, Lyra, and Kale. They had fallen into an odd rhythm, neither hostile nor friendly, but constantly on edge, as if they were all waiting for something to break. Gideon worked hard to keep things moving. The garden was nearly finished for the season, and he began preparing the small barn for the colder months ahead. He spent more time outside, hoping the physical distance would ease the strain between the two women. But it wasn't enough. He could feel the eyes of Lyra and Kale on him whenever they shared a meal or crossed paths. They were aware of something unspoken between them, something that no one dared acknowledge. One afternoon, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Lyra and Kale were sitting on the porch, their faces lit in the warm glow. The sight of them together, so close, so comfortable, was unsettling to Gideon, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He had never been good with these kinds of things. Relationships, intimacy. Still, when Lyra turned her head slightly and caught his gaze from across the yard, he felt the shift in the air. Her eyes were narrowed, intense, though there was something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. He didn't know if it was challenge or curiosity, but it felt as if she were waiting for him to make the first move. Gideon set down the rake he had been holding and walked toward them, his boots crunching the dried leaves beneath him. "You two need something?" he asked, keeping his voice steady, though his heart was racing for reasons he didn't fully understand. Kale was the first to speak, her usual playful demeanor in full force. "Not much, just getting used to the quiet around here." She smiled up at him, though there was something oddly sharp behind the smile. "I'd say it's nice, but it's kind of hard to get used to." Lyra's response was more subdued, her gaze flicking from Kale to Gideon and back again. "It's not what I expected," she said, her voice low, almost contemplative. "But it's not terrible." Gideon could feel the tension thickening again. It wasn't just the space between them that felt heavy. It was the things they weren't saying, the distance that had grown between them emotionally. There was no denying it anymore, the awkwardness, the undercurrent of something more. "Good," Gideon said, trying to break the silence, though his words felt strangely hollow. "It'll get easier the longer you're here. Just takes time." Lyra's eyes didn't leave him as she spoke again, this time her tone sharper. "You think I'll just settle here? After everything?" The question was unexpected, and Gideon hesitated before responding. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but if you want to stay, then that's your choice. I'm not going to force you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Gideon thought Lyra might say something more. But she simply turned her gaze back to the horizon, her face unreadable. Kale, however, seemed to sense the shift. She stood, stretching with an exaggerated yawn. "Well, I think I'll go check on the barn. Make sure we're ready for the next storm." She winked at Lyra before walking off toward the back of the property, leaving Gideon and Lyra alone. Gideon watched her go, his thoughts tangled in the oddness of the moment. But then Lyra's voice cut through his reverie. "You really don't understand, do you?" she asked, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. He turned to face her fully, a slight frown forming on his brow. "Understand what?" Her eyes locked onto his, something dark flickering behind them. "What it's like to be cast aside, to be thrown into a world that doesn't want you, to be treated like a tool or a monster instead of a person." The words hung in the air between them, and Gideon felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He had been careful to respect them, to give them space, but he hadn't truly understood. He had only seen them as strangers, as two women from another world, not as individuals with their own pain. Lyra stood up suddenly, her body tense, like she might flee at any moment. "I'm not like you," she said, her voice almost bitter now. "I don't belong here, and I'm not going to pretend that I do." Gideon's heart skipped a beat as he stepped toward her, not sure what he was trying to do. "I'm not asking you to pretend," he said gently. "But if you want to be here, then you'll have to make that choice. For yourself, not for anyone else." For a moment, Lyra said nothing. She stood there, her chest rising and falling with every breath, her eyes focused on something distant. The wind tugged at her hair, and the soft rustling of the trees was the only sound. Then, without warning, she turned and walked toward the house, her movements stiff. Gideon stood there for a long moment, unsure of what he had said or done. Something had shifted in that brief exchange. He could feel it, like the air had thickened, like they were on the edge of something neither of them could stop. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, but it felt colder somehow. The space between him and Lyra felt even more charged now, as if they were both waiting for the other to make the next move. He couldn't ignore the pull between them, but he didn't know what to do with it. Kale came back inside shortly afterward, her eyes flicking between him and Lyra, though she said nothing. She could feel the tension, too, but didn't want to address it directly. "We're almost done with the barn," Kale said, her voice light as she started setting the table for dinner. "Just need to secure a few more things before the storm hits. Think you can give us a hand afterward?" Gideon nodded absently, still lost in his thoughts. "Sure, I'll be there." Dinner passed quietly, with neither Lyra nor Kale speaking much. The conversation was dull, filled with only the bare necessities. Gideon could feel the undercurrent of something more profound, but no one spoke of it. They ate in silence, the weight of the unspoken growing heavier with each passing minute. As the evening wore on and the sky darkened, Gideon knew he had a choice to make. He could continue to ignore the tension simmering between him and Lyra, or he could face it head-on. But whatever happened next, he could feel that the fragile peace they had was nearing its breaking point. The morning was colder than usual, a sharp chill in the air that made Gideon's breath fog in front of him. The winds of winter were settling in, promising long nights and heavy snow. He had already begun making preparations for the cold, storing supplies and double-checking the roof. But as always, it felt like there was more to do. He had barely finished breakfast when Kale came to him, looking uncharacteristically serious. "I'm heading out to check the east field. It's almost time to gather the last of the winter crops, but there's something I need to take care of first. Could you keep an eye on Lyra?" Gideon paused, unsure of the request. He'd been getting used to the delicate balance between the three of them, but Kale's request felt different, more intentional. She didn't meet his eyes as she spoke, her voice slightly softer than usual. "I think she might need some company today. Just make sure she's all right." Gideon didn't know what to say. It wasn't like Kale to ask him to keep an eye on Lyra, and the way she'd said it, it felt like there was something more beneath the surface. Something Kale wasn't saying. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though his thoughts were elsewhere. "I'll check on her. Don't worry about it." Kale offered a quick smile before turning away, heading toward the fields. Gideon, left in the silence of the house, walked to the back door, hesitant. Lyra was outside, as usual, her form silhouetted against the pale morning sky. She was perched on a low fence near the garden, her legs crossed and her gaze fixed on the horizon. She hadn't noticed him yet, but it was only a matter of time. He stepped out into the cold air, wrapping his coat tighter around his shoulders. There was something about the way she sat there, still and contemplative, that felt heavy. She wasn't doing anything, just staring, as if lost in thought. He wondered if she knew how often she did that, stared off into the distance like she was somewhere else, somewhere far away from this place. "Lyra?" he called, his voice cutting through the quiet. She turned her head slowly, a soft but unreadable expression on her face. Gideon approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the frosted earth. "Kale went out to the east field. She asked me to keep you company." He felt awkward saying it, as if he were intruding on something personal. Lyra didn't say anything at first, just nodded slightly, her eyes distant. "I don't need anyone to keep me company." Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a thin layer of frustration. "I didn't mean to intrude," Gideon said quickly, "but she's concerned." "I thought—" "I'm fine," she interrupted, her voice sharp now. She stood up suddenly, brushing off her clothes as if trying to shake off his presence. "I don't need anyone worrying about me." Gideon felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he had done something wrong. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. "Just thought it might help, you know?" Lyra turned to face him fully then, her gaze intense, almost challenging. "Help with what? What is it you think you can help me with, Gideon?" The question was sharp, as though she were daring him to answer. Gideon felt the tension between them rising, an unspoken challenge that neither of them was willing to back down from. There were moments like now when it felt like they were on the verge of something big, but he couldn't figure out what. "I don't know," he said, his voice quieter now. Maybe just help you figure things out. You've been through a lot. I know you've been struggling with being here. He gestured vaguely, unsure of how to say what he meant. I just don't want you to feel alone in it. Lyra's expression softened, but only for a brief moment, before the walls snapped back into place. You don't get it, Gideon, she said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. You don't know what it's like to be sent here like some kind of punishment, to be treated like an outsider, like I don't belong. Her words cut through him, a raw honesty that made something inside him tighten. He'd never truly understood what it must be like for her. The isolation, the resentment of being forced into a world that wasn't her own. I can't imagine what you're going through, he said, his voice sincere. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. You don't have to go through it alone. For a moment, Lyra didn't respond. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. And then, as if shaking off the weight of the conversation, she let out a soft sigh. Why do you keep trying to help me? She asked, almost as if she were puzzled by the question. What's in it for you? Gideon blinked, taken aback by the question. It was blunt, but it was also fair. Why had he been trying to help her? Because it's the right thing to do, he answered honestly. I don't want to see anyone suffer if I can do something about it. Lyra seemed to consider this for a long moment, her gaze still locked on his. She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing his words, before finally breaking eye contact and turning away. Don't waste your time, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Gideon could see the barrier returning between them, the wall she had built to keep him out. But this time something felt different. There was a vulnerability to her he hadn't noticed before. An openness, a crack in her defenses. He took a cautious step closer, his voice soft. I'm not giving up on you, Lyra, even if you don't want me around. For the briefest moment, she looked over her shoulder at him, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the moment passed. She turned fully away from him, heading toward the house without another word. Gideon stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. The conversation had ended as abruptly as it had started, and he couldn't tell if anything had changed between them. But the weight of the unspoken words lingered in the air, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, something important. As the evening drew near, he found himself still thinking about it. The tension between them wasn't gone. It never really had been. But now it felt like there was something more to it, a depth that neither of them had dared to acknowledge before. Later that night, after dinner, Kale returned, her mood still upbeat despite the heavy work ahead of her. She didn't comment on the moment between him and Lyra, but there was a knowing look in her eyes, as if she had seen it all before. Gideon couldn't help but wonder what Kale knew about Lyra that he didn't. And more than that, he wondered if this fragile truce between them could last, or if the tension would finally break. The days following their conversation were colder, both outside and between Gideon and Lyra. The walls they had built around themselves were higher now, more impenetrable. Lyra was quiet, more withdrawn than before, and though Gideon tried to find small ways to bridge the distance, leaving her a cup of tea when she was alone or offering help with odd tasks, she remained distant. Kale, however, seemed to notice the change. She would throw a knowing glance at him when she thought Lyra wasn't looking, but she never spoke of it. One morning, as the wind howled outside, Kale was in the barn, making sure everything was secure. The day was gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of snow. Gideon had just finished a small chore when he spotted Lyra standing in the garden, her back to him. She had been tending to the plants, though she seemed lost in thought, her movements slow and absent. Gideon approached quietly, careful not to disturb her too abruptly. You should come inside, he said gently, his voice cutting through the silence. It's going to snow soon. Lyra stiffened, as though startled by his presence, before turning to face him. Her eyes were unreadable, but there was something guarded in her posture. I'm fine, she said, her voice distant. I want to finish up here. Gideon hesitated, not sure if pushing further would make things better or worse. But he couldn't help himself. He stepped closer, just enough to show her he wasn't going to let it go so easily. Lyra, he began softly, you don't have to keep pushing everyone away. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a mix of frustration and something else flashing across her features. You think you understand, don't you? She asked, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. You think you know what I need, but you have no idea. Gideon swallowed, trying to keep his composure. He had seen the anger in her before, but this felt different, deeper. I don't know everything about what you've been through, he said, his voice steady. But I'm here for you. You don't have to do this alone. She let out a harsh laugh, though it was devoid of humor. Do you think that's what I want? She asked, her words heavy with a mix of bitterness and weariness. I don't need anyone's pity. Not yours. Not anyone's. The words stung, but he couldn't bring himself to back away. He wanted to understand, wanted to help, but he didn't know how. He had never been good with people like this. People who built walls so high he couldn't see over them. I'm not pitying you, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I'm just trying to offer something real. A way to connect. For a moment there was silence. Lyra's gaze softened, but the defensive walls remained. Her lips parted, as though she might say something more, but she stopped herself. Her eyes dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping ever so slightly. I don't want to hurt anyone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But every time I let someone in, it feels like I'm losing something I can't get back. The vulnerability in her voice caught him off guard, and he took a step closer. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, whether she would let him in or shut him out entirely, but he couldn't stand the thought of her carrying that weight alone. Lyra, he said softly, almost coaxing her to look at him. I won't ask you to open up. I just want you to know that if you ever want to, if you ever need to, there's no need to push me away. I'm here, and I won't leave. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. There was something raw in her expression, a mixture of confusion and hope, but also fear. Fear that if she let someone in, they would leave her. I'm not going anywhere, he repeated, his voice firm now, as if to emphasize his promise. Lyra's eyes searched his face for a moment, and he could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were trying to read him, trying to figure out if he truly meant it. Finally, she looked away, her voice steady but with a note of hesitation. I don't know how to trust people anymore, she admitted, her words barely audible against the howling wind. Gideon reached out, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel his presence. Trust doesn't come easily, he said, but if you ever want to start, I'll be here. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the tension between them thickening, though there was a subtle shift. It was as if the ice around Lyra's heart had cracked, just slightly. She didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. The storm rolled in quickly, the wind picking up, and snowflakes began to fall. Kale's figure appeared in the distance, returning from the fields, and Gideon knew that it was time to head inside. Come inside, he said, his voice soft but insistent. It's going to get worse. Lyra didn't argue. She nodded once and turned toward the house, her movements slow, as if she were still processing everything that had been said. Gideon followed behind her, his heart racing. The silence between them was still there, but it felt different now, less suffocating somehow. As they entered the warmth of the house, the fire crackling in the hearth, Kale greeted them with a casual smile, though her eyes lingered on Lyra, as if trying to gauge her mood. You two get caught in the storm? Kale asked, her tone light. Gideon gave a small nod, keeping his gaze on Lyra, though he could tell she was still caught up in her thoughts. I think we're all right, Gideon said, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty. Just needed some time to talk. Kale didn't push the issue, though there was a look in her eyes that suggested she knew more than she let on. She turned away, heading toward the kitchen to prepare for dinner, leaving Gideon and Lyra alone in the room. Lyra sank into the chair by the fire, her gaze distant again. Gideon stood by the door for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then he stepped closer. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft. Lyra's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but she only nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I'll be fine, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Gideon didn't press her further. Instead, he took a seat across from her, letting the silence settle between them. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't as heavy as it had been before. There was a tentative understanding between them now, one that neither of them fully understood, but both of them seemed to acknowledge. As the evening wore on, and the storm raged outside, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting. The space between them was still charged with unspoken words and feelings, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like something was finally beginning to break. The days continued to pass in a slow, almost comfortable rhythm. The snow piled up outside, isolating the small farm from the world, but it seemed to bring a strange sort of peace. Each of them, in their own way, had found a way to settle into the quiet of the house, though tension still simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. Lyra was quieter than ever. She moved through the house with an air of reluctance, as if she were just waiting for the next moment of discomfort to come. Her interactions with Gideon were less frequent, though they weren't hostile, just tentative, as if both of them were still learning how to navigate this fragile new space between them. Gideon, too, felt the weight of the silence. He had long since accepted that Lyra would take her time, but it didn't stop him from wanting to reach out. Every glance she gave him felt like an unreadable riddle, a puzzle he could not solve. There were moments when she seemed on the verge of saying something, her eyes flicking toward him, her lips parting like she wanted to speak, but she would always pull back. It wasn't until one evening, when the snowstorm outside raged fiercely, that things finally began to change. They were all gathered around the fire in the living room, the warmth from the flames a welcome contrast to the chill that had seeped into the bones of the house. Kale sat across from Lyra, playing a card game with her, her laughter light and easy, though Lyra's responses were subdued. Gideon, leaning against the wall near the window, watched the two of them, wondering when, if, he would ever understand Lyra's reticence. Gideon, you're being awfully quiet tonight, Kale remarked, her voice light but pointed. Gideon chuckled softly, though there was no real humor in it. Just tired. Long day. Kale raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't push. Instead, her attention shifted back to Lyra, who was carefully setting down her cards. For a brief moment, their eyes met, Lyra's dark gaze meeting Gideon's in a way that sent a strange electric tension down his spine. There was something in her look, something he couldn't quite place, but it was enough to make his heart race. Lyra looked away quickly, a flush creeping up her neck. She was always so guarded, and it was becoming harder to decipher what lay behind those walls. You've been quiet too, Gideon said, his voice softer than he intended. Everything okay? Lyra stiffened, the usual defense flickering in her eyes, but this time she didn't immediately retreat. Instead, she gave a small nod. I'm fine. Kale looked between them, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I think you two are the last people in this room who can be described as fine, but I'm not going to play matchmaker. Not tonight. Her teasing tone lightened the mood, but the undercurrent between Gideon and Lyra remained. Kale stood from the couch with a stretch, offering a quick smile to both of them before heading toward the kitchen. The fire crackled. The silence that followed felt heavier. Gideon wasn't sure how long they sat there, the quiet stretching between them like a tightrope. Lyra, however, seemed to be gathering herself. There was something in the air, something palpable that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Finally, Lyra exhaled, the breath shaky. She turned her head toward him again, but this time there was no coldness in her gaze. No walls, just a softness that seemed unfamiliar. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't ask to be brought here. To you. Gideon felt a pang of understanding in his chest, but he said nothing, letting her continue. I didn't expect any of this, she added, her words trailing off as though she were searching for something to say that would make sense of everything. He wanted to respond, to tell her that he hadn't asked for it either, but he wasn't sure how to put that into words. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching hers. You don't have to explain anything to me, Lyra. I'm just here, whatever you need. There was a long pause before she finally broke eye contact, looking down at her hands. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet, peaceful, almost. I'm afraid, Lyra admitted quietly, her voice so soft that Gideon almost didn't hear it. His heart skipped a beat at her vulnerability. She was afraid. Of what? Of him? Of the situation she found herself in? He wasn't sure, but he felt an overwhelming need to comfort her. You don't need to be afraid, he said gently, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment. You're not alone, Lyra. Not anymore. Her gaze flickered back to him, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed uncertain, as if she were on the edge of something, of crossing a line she didn't know whether she was ready to cross. Gideon stood up slowly, careful not to rush her, and took a step closer to the couch where she sat. The space between them had never felt so charged, so filled with unspoken understanding. He wasn't sure where this moment would lead, but he knew something was shifting, something that had been locked away between them for far too long. I'm here, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever you need, I'm here. Lyra swallowed, her eyes shimmering with unshed emotion, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed. She didn't speak, but there was a look in her eyes, a flicker of something, something like acceptance, like she might just be willing to believe him, to trust him. Gideon held his breath, his gaze locked on hers, waiting. But before either of them could say anything more, Kale returned from the kitchen, holding a tray of food, breaking the fragile moment like a stone dropped into a still pond. Dinner's ready, Kale said with her usual carefree smile, though the glint in her eyes suggested she knew more than she let on. I'd say you two need a break from all the quiet. Lyra's shoulders tensed again, the walls snapping back into place as she pulled away from the moment. She nodded stiffly, standing up quickly. Thanks, Kale. Gideon watched as Lyra moved toward the table, her back straight, her eyes downcast. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the vulnerability she had just shown was buried once again, hidden behind a carefully constructed mask. But Gideon couldn't help but wonder if, for just a moment, he had seen something, something real, something that meant they were closer to breaking the walls between them than either of them had realized. As the three of them sat down to dinner, the weight of the unspoken words lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long while, Gideon felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the verge of something more than they had ever expected. But what would that look like? What would it cost them to truly let go and let themselves be seen? He didn't know, but he was ready to find out. The days after the quiet dinner stretched on, but something had shifted. Gideon could feel it in the way Lyra moved around him, the small glances she sent his way, the subtle way she would linger when they spoke, as if she were testing the waters. He, too, had changed, his thoughts less clouded by the past, more focused on what was unfolding between them now. There was still a sense of uncertainty, but it was no longer as sharp, no longer as impenetrable. The next evening, the snowstorm finally began to ease, and the pale light of dusk filtered softly through the windows. The wind no longer howled, but a stillness had settled over the world outside, a calm after the storm. Inside, the house was warm, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, everything felt right. They were sitting together around the fire again, Gideon, Lyra, and Kale, though this time the atmosphere was different. The tension had eased, replaced by something gentler, more hopeful. Lyra was sitting next to Gideon, her posture still guarded but less stiff, the space between them smaller than it had ever been before. She had a distant look in her eyes, but every now and then, she would catch his gaze, a flicker of something soft and curious in her expression. Gideon couldn't help but feel drawn to her. The barrier between them was crumbling, slowly, as if she were letting him in little by little. Kale, ever the observant one, was quietly watching the two of them. Her grin was sly but warm, a knowing look in her eyes that made Gideon wonder just how much she had seen of their unspoken moments. She was quiet, too, as if she didn't want to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled in the room. The fire crackled, its warmth filling the silence. After a while, Kale stood, stretching her arms above her head. Well, I think I'll retire for the night. You two enjoy the fire. Gideon glanced up at her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. Kale's smile deepened, but she said nothing more. She simply gave a small wave and left the room, the sound of her footsteps fading as she made her way upstairs. Lyra shifted in her seat, her eyes following Kale's exit. When the sound of Kale's footsteps disappeared, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The quiet between Gideon and Lyra was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with a new understanding, a tentative truce. Gideon leaned forward slightly, his voice low. It's nice, isn't it? The quiet. Lyra nodded, her gaze briefly meeting his before she looked down. It's better than I expected. She hesitated for a moment before adding, I didn't think I'd ever feel this way. Gideon's heart skipped a beat. There it was again. Something soft, something that hinted at the depth of her emotions, something that made him feel closer to her than ever before. What way? She paused, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, unsure of how to articulate what she felt. Safe. I didn't think I would ever feel safe here with you. The simplicity of her words struck him more than anything. Safe. It was a word that carried so much weight, so much meaning in this moment. He had never expected to hear it from her, never imagined that she would feel that way about him, especially considering where they had started. I'm glad, Gideon said quietly, his voice soft, sincere. I want you to feel that way. I want you to feel like you belong here. Her eyes flicked back to him, the vulnerability in her gaze impossible to ignore. There was a moment where neither of them spoke, as if the weight of her words hung in the air between them. It was as if they were both holding their breath, waiting for something, though neither of them knew exactly what that something was. Slowly, Lyra shifted closer, her body instinctively drawing nearer to his. The firelight danced in her eyes, casting flickering shadows across her face. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and rested it gently on the arm of his chair. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, and Gideon felt his pulse quicken at the contact. I don't know what this is, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want to let it go. Not yet. Gideon's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the intensity of the moment building, the proximity between them growing as their shared silence deepened. He didn't know where this was going, but he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want it to end either. There was something about Lyra that had pulled him in, something that had kept him coming back, even when he wasn't sure of what would come next. He reached up, his hand brushing against hers where it rested on the arm of his chair, the touch tentative but filled with meaning. I don't want to let go either, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Lyra's fingers curled slightly around his, the warmth of her touch sending a jolt of energy through him. She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she leaned in just slightly, as if testing the waters. Her breath brushed across his skin, warm and steady, and for a split second, it felt like the whole world outside had disappeared. There was only the two of them, the quiet, the warmth, the unspoken understanding between them. And then, without a word, Lyra closed the distance between them. Her lips brushed his, soft and tentative at first, as though she were waiting for some sort of reaction. When Gideon didn't pull away, when he didn't hesitate, she deepened the kiss, her hand coming up to rest on his chest. The kiss was slow, gentle, as if they were both savoring the moment, allowing themselves to feel everything that had been building between them for so long. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest, the world around them fading until there was nothing left but the feeling of her, the warmth of her body close to his, the taste of her lips. The kiss broke after a few moments, and Lyra pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. I never thought this would happen, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But it feels like It's meant to be. Gideon smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. Maybe it is, he said, his voice low and filled with tenderness. The fire crackled beside them, but in that moment, there was no need for words. They both understood that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, that they still had many challenges to face. But in that kiss, in that shared moment of quiet intimacy, they had found something they hadn't expected, something worth holding on to. And with that unspoken promise, they both knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, they would face it together.